So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for episode 8 of the EDI Catalyst podcast presented by the Carbon to Metal Coating Institute. I'm your host, Dana Nanan, and today I will be co-hosting the session with Mark Aloisio. Say hi, Mark.
Hey, hey.
Okay, so in this podcast series, we hope to explore topics of equity, diversity, inclusion, and indigeneity in STEM, featuring guest speakers from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, discussing their lived experiences, as well as providing resources and tips on how to create more inclusive and equitable environments.
Through this, we hope to inspire you to become a catalyst for change in your own communities and workspaces. A few notes before we start. There will be a time at the end of this session for members of our live audience here today to ask any questions. So please remain muted for the remainder of this, and we add your questions into the comments, and we can address them at the end.
Cool. Okay, so we're so excited to kick off this year's podcast series by discussing Indigenous excellence in STEM, and we are extremely honored to have Dr. Alex Veinot join us today as today's esteemed guest, live all the way from Nova Scotia in his newly appointed role of assistant professor in the Department of Chemistry at Dalhousie University. So hello, Alex.
Hi, thanks for the invitation, and it's really good to see a lot of familiar faces and catch up with people. So
Great to have you on, Alex. Appreciate it. So as we get into it, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Where are you from initially, and how'd you get started in the field of chemistry?
yeah, so for me, coming back to Nova Scotia it's fantastic. So I was originally from Nova Scotia. I was born in the small town that nobody's heard of, Middleton. It's a population of like 1,500 people, so very small town. So I'm like, coming from rural Nova Scotia here. And so, for me, it's not exactly a town that produces academics or even chemists for that matter. So, it's really quite an interesting story how I got into science and chemistry. For me personally, I didn't like school much. I didn't really do well in school for the longest time. I was just often bored. So I was the type of student in high school that would always be in detention, and like the least likely you would expect to be an academic. And it was actually so bad. At one point, I had an uncle that was an RCMP officer. We kind of sat down and he gave me the talk, like, if you don't straighten up soon, it's gonna be jail and whatnot, which is surprising for somebody in my position, but yeah, that was kind of how I got interested in science. Was we were chatting and I just asked him, like, tell me a bit about your Kevlar vest. And for me, he described it as being a plastic stronger than steel. And that was really what kind of got me interested in chemistry to begin with. Was how can you do that? Like, how can you make a plastic, which from what I had known at the time was like shopping bags and stuff like that, right? Toys. Like, how can you make something like that stronger than steel and like stop a bullet? And so that got me interested in my first chemistry course. And at the time, it was a real challenge to get into that sort of type of class, because I wasn't the best academic, and it was basically I missed out on a lot of the coursework that I would have needed in high school, because I was put into a co-op program designed basically to just push people like me through the school system. And so through a lot of hardship with the admin staff and fighting with them, they eventually let me take my first chemistry course, and I turned out to really enjoy chemistry and loved it. And like, for me, quantification of matter was kind of that was what I really enjoyed early on, was being able to like calculate how many molecules of X are in like this amount of material. Like, that seems so cool. And I did really well at that, and that's what kind of kept me in with chemistry in high school, which ultimately led to going to university. And for me, it again, because of my past, I didn't have all the math I needed, so I ended up actually doing an extra year of high school to pick up on my calculus and pre-calculus just to make it into university. So it's a huge change from like the kid that really hated school at one point to like take his first chemistry course, and then all of a sudden he's like doing extra schoolwork and going to university. Like, nobody can believe it. And people now, when they see me, it's like they're shocked.
Wow, that's crazy how you went from going through all of that in Nova Scotia to becoming a Vanier scholar. And very interesting to hear the challenges that you kind of faced. Were there any other challenges, when you finally got to university that you may have had to, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, so related to like like being indigenous, it was something I never thought much of early on. Certainly for me, I was the first person in my family to go off to university. So neither of my parents had even finished high school. It was, a different time when they were going through where you could like, drop out early and go off to vocational school and still be successful. So, I didn't have that sort of background knowledge going in to go to university. So I had to learn a lot of things on my own, which was quite challenging. And so for me, I really had to talk to the people that were in the know and like ask as many questions as I could to kind of figure things out for myself. And being indigenous, I also knew that being from a small rural part of the province and the country, like you could be treated differently for making that fact known. And so, as somebody that doesn't exactly look native, I found it was actually quite easy to not say anything and just kind of hid my identity for a while. So, all throughout my time at Acadia as an undergraduate, even during grad school when I was a master's student, I just didn't talk about it. I didn't want it to be something that was associated with me. I wanted to just put it to the side and focus on doing my work. And as I got a little older, I recognized how important it actually was to make that known because, for me, I felt that if I had made my status known, that it would become something that people would judge me for and treat me differently for. And the reason for that is because looking around, you don't see any of your peers represented. There's very few other Indigenous scholars out there. And so without that background, and like that representation, it can be quite challenging to be the first one. And there's always that sort of need to prove that you belong somewhere and feel that you've earned your spot. And without that representation, that pressure is very high. And so, going through, I felt a lot of that pressure and that need to sort of perform and that drive. And, looking back, if I had more of that representation and somebody to help me and say, look, you don't need to try so hard, like that would have been much better for me in terms of, mental health and being happy. So, for me, that was some of the things that I had struggled with quite a bit.
Thank you for sharing. That's quite impactful. Actually, it's a great transition to our next question. Being this champion that you of indigeneity, and especially in the STEM field, you've been actively promoting the STEM within the Indigenous communities and other outreach activities. Could you discuss any initiatives or programs that you've led or participated in?
Yeah, so I've been pretty involved as trying to become that role model that I wish I had when I was coming up through. And so I try to make a better, presence of myself and, make it known that I'm native and doing really well in science because I think that part is very, very important. And in my own community, now that I'm back, I've actually got a lot more opportunities to get involved with my community and try to increase representation. And since being back, there have been a few of the youth that have, expressed interest in getting, demonstrations and little workshops and stuff. So I'm looking forward to kicking some of that stuff off. Once I get established here, my own space, you got to take care of home first, right? But, that's kind of in the future. But yeah, in terms of what I've been trying to do is really just be present, be a good role model, and help those that can. Just being that person that's like, hey, it doesn't have to be so difficult. And if you do have, questions, please ask, and I will help to guide the best I can. But with that, there's other sort of aspects too that I've been interested in. So obviously, funding's a really big one. So a lot of the funding that goes into Indigenous academics, they don't really talk a lot about science. It's not as heavily represented, I think, which is a problem. And a big thing I've kind of reflected on is a lack of research opportunities for Indigenous people, because for me that was a critical part of my development, was getting into a lab and getting hands-on experience. I mean, many Indigenous scholars are experiential learners and they have to work hands on, and they're also lifelong learners. And so, they might not necessarily qualify for the same sort of scholarships like NSERC because they don't have the grades. And usually that is tied to some equity related consequences. Maybe they've got community ties or responsibilities that, they also have to be mindful of. And so, I've been trying to push some of the local Indigenous groups here as well to try to provide increased access to funding to provide research opportunities for Indigenous scholars in science, because it's such an important step in getting the experience you need to go into grad school. So I think it's very important, and one of the first steps to increasing that representation that's critical for you know more Indigenous representation in science.
Yeah, and I think with all that encouraging representation, you're absolutely right. Like it starts with funding. It starts with, getting professors in and uh being interested in, hiring these students. But from your perspective, what can we do as students and grad students and like in the field currently in STEM to help promote the success of these Indigenous students beyond funding? And is there something we can do culturally or environmentally to help that? And are there any specific actions or initiatives you believe would be particularly effective?
Yeah, so I think for myself, it's going to be different for everybody, but for me, having that representation was key. And for the longest time, I was the only Indigenous scholar I'd known in chemistry. It wasn't until like my fourth year of my PhD that I had met anyone else in chemistry that was Indigenous. And so, for me, representation has always been one of those things that it's the critical sort of factors. If you've got more people standing up and saying, I belong to this group and I'm doing, science, then it makes it more, it makes it more comfortable for people to also, step forward that are also part of that group. And there's that sort of safety in doing so. Because, for me, I didn't really want to talk about it because there is such a stigma around it. And, for many years, it was never a good thing to make it known that you were Native. We were always kind of treated as second class citizens. And so, there's many people, that just never acknowledged it, and, for many reasons. And so, more recently, I think it's become more of a, more acceptable, I guess, to be Native, if that kind of makes sense. There's more sort of pride with that identity now. And for me, it's not like it's that far in the past. Like I did my undergrad 10 years ago and I still felt like I had to hide my identity. So only within the last few years has it become more sort of, acceptable to identify as being Native. And I think with more people coming forward, there's going to be that greater, sense of safety and also making it known. Because I know there's a lot of people that were like me that don't really talk about it openly, and they don't want to, they don't want to have that associated with them because they might be treated differently, and it's tough.
No, 100%. Yeah. The discussion's been great with regards to a more national or even provincial level of this inclusivity. But like you said, echo your comment before of got to take care of home. As a new professor, what are some strategies you plan to incorporate into your current group or soon to be group that will foster all of this inclusivity?
Yeah, so it's quite challenging, I think, to kind of bring science to Indigenous communities. But I think here I have an advantage of being a member of one of the local communities. So trying to bring more Indigenous people into science, it's always challenged by the fact that there's that trust that you need to establish with those communities. And so it can be very difficult for somebody that's not part of the group already, or somebody that's not associated with the group, to try to make any sort of change, because the communities, if they don't trust you, they're not going to budge. So I think having that advantage, I'm really looking forward to trying to increase representation, Indigenous representation in science, through again some of these outreach activities, talking to the community leaders and trying to identify the specific needs of the communities as well, and see what their priorities are. Because sort of my long-term goal is to help empower Indigenous communities with the knowledge and the means to do their own science and kind of direct their own science. And it's quite difficult, but there's at least in this my my sort of area now. I've noticed, my community, we're taking a more proactive approach to some things, especially related to energy. We've got our own. So I'm a member of Glooscap First Nation, and we've recently established Glooscap Energy. So they're starting to think about solar opportunities for energy, and they're getting a lot of these government grants and things like that for putting in solar and stuff. But what I've noticed in a lot of the conversations that's absent is like talking about life cycle analysis and like what's actually the payoff. And a lot of those discussions that are absent that would really benefit from having like a scientific knowledge. And they're coming at it more of like a business perspective, but I think having scientists at the table will be very important for those sorts of initiatives. And that's why I think we need to increase that representation. And so, talking to the communities, trying to see what the priorities are, just meeting the needs of the communities, I think is what I'm going to look at going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I think you're in a very good position to like push forward those initiatives. And I genuinely hope in the future there's more Indigenous representation at these higher level positions in academia. You've shared a lot of really good advice and just shared a lot about your own personal experience. But are there any like final messages or key takeaways you'd like to leave for our listeners today?
I guess, don't be discouraged that, things are tough. Like I keep telling people here now, like, as somebody that's come up through, like it's hard. Chemistry's hard, and it's okay that it's hard. What we do is intrinsically hard. You tell people all the time, like, what do you do? Oh, I'm a chemist. There's always the groan of, oh, I hated that. So, when things get hard, don't feel bad. It's hard for everybody. Just kind of stick with it, ask lots of questions, try to learn as much as you can, and over time it'll come, and then you'll look back and see just how far you've came through your journey with chemistry and how rewarding it can be. It's kind of what I've gathered.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Alex. That's all the programmed questions, if you will. Is there any questions from the audience? There hasn't been anything in the chat, but we'll open it up for anyone here present, if any at all. I can kick things off if need. You were very fortunate to experience the higher level education in 2 different provinces. Can you comment on your experiences in either province, if you saw more support in one versus the other? And
so for me, coming from a rural part of the country, it was always a challenge of making that transition to like a bigger city. So I was very conscious of making those decisions when going to school. Like my first step was going to Acadia because it's quite a small town. Like Wolfville, Nova Scotia, it might cap out at like 10,000 people when the university's full. Most of that's like university students. It's very small, very rural. But you kind of take that time. You're not adjusting so much to like going from rural to city life. You're just kind of learning the university setting, right? And kind of adjusting to being on your own. So for me, that was why I chose to go to Acadia. It was to kind of figure out first how to be on my own and navigate university. Then I recognized I need to be comfortable with the city because most universities are in cities. So for my master's, I actually stayed within the province because I had the safety net of my family, my community. So I went to Halifax because it's a city, it's bigger than I'm used to, and I can kind of start adjusting to living in a city. And so I thought, okay, this is fine. Now I kind of got the city down, but I'm still kind of in the safety net if I have the people I know, nearby in case things go bad. So then moving to Kingston, it's still kind of a city, but it's not that big of a city. It's certainly no Toronto, which seems terrifying. It's not as big as some other places like London, but it's kind of big enough, and it kind of tests the fact then, okay, we're out of province, the safety net's gone, we're kind of on our own. So, then I kind of adjusted to being more independent at that stage. And then finally going to London, it was a bigger city without, the safety. That was kind of my progression. And I found that very effective for me personally, just making those gradual transitions, because some of my peers that were with me at Acadia, they made that big jump from going from small town Nova Scotia to like U of A, and then they kind of flunked out because the change was just too much all at once, and they just had a lot of difficulties adjusting. So I think for me that was one of the factors to my success. In terms of support, I had some fantastic support, partially because I had some really good groups, coming up through, very supportive mentors and very good, research groups to fall back on when things were tough and I had, questions. And so I think that was also another factor to a lot of my success, was just getting lucky with, the right groups. So, that's kind of it.
And we were very fortunate to have you out here too, Alex. Nice seeing you again. I think Kathy has a question for you.
Yeah, I was more of a comment. I was just going to say as well, you're being very modest, Alex. You're a phenomenal student, and Dal is very lucky to have you. But I did want to, just say that I think, just to reiterate how important it is to be able to be yourself, and not have to hide your identity. And I think that, people in the LGBTQ community face that too. It's a broad thing. And also your comment about how, I mean, you educated me on this about, how recent some of the racism and genocide was towards Indigenous people. And so that's you know, still shocking to me. And I think that's how we should be shocked. But I also want to say I resonate with your comment about not wanting to be outed, sort of. I mean, when I was younger, I was one of very few women in every place I was, and I didn't want to be thought of as a female chemist. I want to be thought of as a chemist. And so you wanted your identity to be with your achievements, not your, not who you are, but that's still part of who you are. So yeah, anyway, advice on how we can do better to encourage more Indigenous students to take the leap that you've done. Like, what can we do? Because it shouldn't all be on people who are in the community.
Yeah, I think, again, making our culture visible is one aspect of it. Certainly it's easier to include more cultural aspects like the arts and humanities, but I think there are some aspects of science that we could do a better job of increasing in indigenizing. And I find it, like, as an inorganic chemist, it's very difficult for me to kind of answer that question, because there's not a lot of relation between like Indigenous values and like inorganic chemistry. The closest I've been able to find, at least personally, is like identifying some of the pigments that were used in a lot of the ceremonial artifacts and clothing. You would use like iron oxides and things like that, so you can introduce iron oxides in some of the ceremonial aspects of indigenized people. But beyond that, like, it's very difficult as an inorganic chemist. But
Yeah,
the organic chemist, they got it easy, right? There's all the natural products you can talk about, and
exactly.
all of this sort of like indigenous medicine and stuff like
Yeah,
that. But
yeah,
I think at this level, there's a few things I do see which I don't particularly like, and this kind of comes back to your comment, Kathy, on being known for the science, not necessarily being a member of like a specific group. And so, I try to not identify myself as an Indigenous scholar so much anymore, because I don't think it's that valuable. It's kind of like Indigenous knowledge versus Western knowledge. Like, it kind of puts two different rankings on the knowledge, when
yeah,
really it's just knowledge is knowledge, and there shouldn't be this distinction. And same with like, science, like Indigenous science versus not. There's just science. And, the fact that I'm Indigenous doing science shouldn't make it any different than if somebody else is doing science. And, it's not, and a lot of the sort of traditional knowledge, just because it wasn't peer reviewed in the same way as you submitted to a journal, it was still peer reviewed. It's just the peers are different. The peers were other members of the community. And the fact that a lot of the sort of same stuff is passed down from generation to generation, that's the proof of the peer review, right? If you're using something that your peers have already used for centuries, like,
yeah.
that's just it. It's not published, right? So I think finding those distinctions, like, it really becomes obvious that there shouldn't be that separation of like Indigenous knowledge versus Western. There shouldn't be Indigenous science versus not. There's just knowledge. There's just science. So,
Thanks,
and I
Alex.
think, and I think having the two separate, it kind of instills that barrier that there's still a, you know, a tier between the two.
Yeah.
And I think if we can avoid that, we'll make a few steps forward.
Thank you.
For sure. We got two more questions. Farnaz, you want to ask yours?
Sure, thank you. I'll be quick. I think Alex answered part of my question. First of all, thank you for sharing your experience, and also congratulations on your new position. It's good to have you, Adele. It was very interesting for me to hear about how much you were emphasizing representation, which gives me a lot to think about how we can, you know, facilitate that in our orbit. Basically, my question overlaps with what Kathy was asking and what you answered, is that representation is the first and, as you mentioned, most important thing, but also what can we do and what shouldn't we do? My question comes from, I don't, last year when I was the chair of IADIA committee in our chemistry department, I was just really struggling with, because we were setting goals for the year and try to hit different targets, and just like indigenization was one of the things that I was struggling with the most. And it can come from my lack of knowledge, definitely. And just there's a knowledge gap, and you want to do something, but you don't want to be performative, and you don't want to do the wrong thing. And I remember, for example, for our science rendezvous, we were just flying around ideas about how we can include more Indigenous way of thinking in our activities that we have in our booth. But I love what you said about the fact that this knowledge is knowledge. There should not be tiered. So any other advice about things not to do, probably, or it would be appreciated. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I guess in terms of what not to do, another thing I've kind of noticed, and this has happened a few times, is, you know, for a while there have been lots of universities trying to fit, like, you know, these hiring quotas, right? And everyone's after Indigenous scholars right now. And, you know, I was being approached by, you know, universities out west and stuff to apply and, you know, try to fill these positions. And, you know, personally, I kind of view it as, you know, you want to strengthen ties to your local communities. You need to hire people that are from those communities. You know, for me to go in, or somebody else that's not kind of a member of those local communities to go in and try to kind of establish those relationships, it's no different than, you know, anyone else, right? And again, it comes back to this level of trust, where you want people to kind of trust, you know, the universities, like Indigenous peoples trust universities. They need to see their people at the table, not just, you know, anyone that fits the Indigenous sort of check marks. You know, that's why I'm also, you know, very fortunate where I'm Mi'kmaq to actually return to Nova Scotia, and I can do, you know, work with Mi'kmaq communities. And I think it's very, very powerful. So, you know, if people that are on these hiring committees, you know, that would be my advice, is like, be reflective, not just on checking the Indigenous box, but also being mindful of the communities in the area, because ultimately, you know, if you want to establish the connections with communities, you need to, you know, bring on people of those communities to first bridge the gap. So,
Thank you.
One last question. If Ian's got a quick question, otherwise we can wrap things up.
Yes, super quick one, and more of a personal one. I know after having like a really long, you know, PhD and academic career, and now you're at the point where you're becoming a professor. I guess I wanted to ask you, what lesson did you learn through your graduate experience that you wish you would have learned a little bit earlier? Like if you were to go back to yourself at, you know, the beginning of your graduate experience and give yourself some knowledge, what would you want to convey?
I belong. You know, for me, I look back, and so for my master's, you know, I did my master's with Jason Masuda, and he was fantastic. I really, you know, enjoyed my time working with Jason. And, you know, when I tell people the horror stories of how much I worked during my master's, everyone's like, oh, Jason must have been like a slave driver. And it's like, no, no, Jason was fantastic. He's the friendliest person, you know, anyone will meet. A lot of, you know, the reason why I worked, you know, 20-hour days during my master's, it was, again, that sort of pressure of feeling like I had to earn my spot, because, you know, I didn't know any other Indigenous people in chemistry or even in science. There wasn't that sort of representation that made me feel like I belonged. And so, constantly feeling like you have to work to earn your seat. I think, it's silly, looking back, it's silly, but at the time, it's like you have that pressure to feel like you need to earn, a spot because it's university, it's prestigious, and, you're a first generation scholar, right? So, looking back, I wouldn't do that again, but, that was sort of my biggest takeaway. And, when I mentor students now, I try to make it very clear that, they don't have to work like that. They don't have to try to earn their spot. Everyone is welcome. And, everyone struggles, everyone needs help, and it's okay.
Wow, thank you for that. And thank you to everyone who asked all questions today. That's all the time we have today, folks. Thank you to Dr. Alex Veinot for joining us today and to sharing this important discussion. And thank you so much to our live audience for listening to today's episode. We hope to see you all back for episode 9 with our very own scientific director, Dr. Kathleen Crennan.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.